Okay, welcome to Chapter 14. Just a couple left. This will actually conclude our examination of the correctional system. And after this, we'll move on. We've got juveniles to look at, and we've got a few of the kind of future issues or cyber issues, again, a topic your book and others are kind of in love with. Okay, a couple quick questions to ask here. You should understand in approaching our studies of the prisons that pretty much everybody, even long-term offenders who go to prison, are going to get out at some point. Most people who go into prison come out. So we can prepare a society and we can prepare the inmate for this period of eventual release or not. And if we do and don't, I think it has consequences that we should discuss when we discuss what prisons are like. The second issue, I think, is a little bit more esoteric, but we have to understand that we have, in many ways, societally, psychologically, we have cast the role of the prisoner as the other. And if much, I think, it's a fair statement, if much of prison is really removing the offender from society and warehousing him, are they still people? In their regards. In other words, I know they're still biologically people, but are they still people in regards to, do they still have the same rights as other people? And obviously they don't have the right of freedom of movement or travel, so what rights do they keep and what rights do they lose, both before they go into prison and after they're in prison? Why? What is the distinguishing characteristics? How do we make this up, this division that we are creating? The third question, pretty important, and this is really recidivism, a big expensive word, but simply means going back to prison. A fair question is, if we design our prisons correctly, why would someone wind up going back to them? And then, what are prisons really like is kind of the last question. We perceive prisons really different, I think, than reality. We'll talk about that with the first slide. But what is prison like for the inmate? What's it like for the visitor, the victim? Because let's not let the victim out of this. The relative of corrections officers, of inmates, of victims. What is it like? Okay. So let's talk about it as a total institution. Prison culture. All institutions have an organizational culture. Particularly what we call total institutions, where an individual is immersed in them. So this can be something as religious as a monastery, as total as the military. Military is a total institution. You go into the military as civilian, they make you into a soldier. You go into a monastery as a civilian, they make you into a monk. Well, a prison has much the same effect. You go in as a civilian and you are made into a convict. So in all of these, now obviously some very positive, if we're talking about the military or the monastery, there can be positive aspects of this, clearly. And in prison, there are some positives that we're trying to promote, obedience to authority, but obviously there's some negatives that are being promoted inside of it. So remembering that if you're going to make a prisoner over by taking him as a civilian, making him into a prisoner, he's going to get out. Now you've got this individual who has gone through the process of prisonization and is now a convict. So prisonization is this process where you acquire the values of the prison. Now, when criminologists study this, they focus on how the individual's attitudes, but more important, how their behavior changes while they're behind bars, how they adapt to the prison. And as they adapt to this total institution, remembering they're going to come out the other end, so they're going to bring a lot of that out with them. So a little bit later we'll talk about gangs in prison, but if you take a civilian who is not a gang member, you put him into a prison where his survival or his prosperity in a certain sense is really predicated on joining a gang, that doesn't stop the day he walks out the door. He very likely is going to bring that gang membership with him. So we have to focus on how life behind bars has changed the inmate. Okay, so inmates can have different personalities going in, which will shape what values they adapt. The prisonization process is, of course, because people are unique to the individual. Now, there might be groups that do the same thing. So these are some of the ways in which you can adapt to it. There are prisoners, typically professional criminals, whatever that means, who want to get into prison, want to get out, so they're going to do their time. They want to speed up their release. They're going to behave within the parameters of the rules and hopefully get out. There's people that, jailing is his name, who they've often been in so long that they've integrated deeply into the structure. And sometimes these people aren't very functional outside of prisons. There's gleaning. Now this is kind of a positive way in which you can approach prison. These are people that go into prisons and they use the prison to improve themselves. I do think part of the problem, and we get to some of the issues about mental illness in prison here, is disorganized criminals. Criminals who go in, inmates who go in, and they have intelligence problems or they are mentally ill, and prison both shapes and reshapes them. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. So who's in prison? So these are demographics of the prison population versus the general population. So notice this first two here. Men and women, obviously, roughly. 50% of the population is male, 50% of the population is women. Those are those two green bars. But you'll notice that 90% of the population in jail is male. Now that means that men are grossly overrepresented in prison. So you can ask the question, because I think this is one of the ways to first start approaching the idea of, well, is there a systemic problem here? Is it the case that men do indeed commit more crimes, maybe even more violent crimes at a 9-to-1 ratio, and that's why they're in prison? So this isn't reflective of something like systemic gender inequality. It's a reflection of actual behavior. So the reason you have 9 times more men in prison is because men are, at least in theory, 9 times more violent. Now that's one explanation. There could be another explanation. We've talked about this in the class of the chivalry effect, that women might commit the same act but unlikely to get the same punishment. So I mean, that's something that has to be examined. Now that really brings us to these next three, which are kind of related: black, white, and Hispanic. When we're using the term black, you'll notice that blacks, by that slide, they look to be about 12.5% of the population, but they're 36 or so percent of the prison population. So blacks are a third of the population, are 12% of the population, but a third of the prison population. Whites are 65 or so percent of the population, but are less than half that, 36 we'll say, make everything easy, of the prison population. And Hispanics are overrepresented as well. So again, you have to ask questions. Is this because there is a systemic issue here? Because when you see a chart of information, the chart can both present and hide information. Is there a systemic issue here, or is it really reflective of behavior? Or both. Okay, so let's talk about some of the looming problems. We're going to talk a little bit about age and mental illness. We have an aging prison population. I'm going to show some charts in a minute, but basically, because our penalties are longer and longer, we're giving very, very long sentences compared to a lot of the world. And because of recidivism penalties, the 3 strikes you're outlaws and things like this, our prison population is getting older. The other issue is it's getting sicker physically. A quick example, there is what some have called a diabetes or a diabetic really tsunami in America, where diabetes is just increasing, in part because of lifestyle and diet, and there's a number of reasons for it. Okay, having said that, you should know that at least at certain stages in diabetes, people need insulin. And insulin has gone up dramatically in cost. It has gone up because even though we've had insulin as a treatment for more than 100 years for a diabetic, there's been refinements to the drug. To be honest about it, I think it's fair to say there's been profiteering based on it as well. So the cost of insulin has exploded. Well, if more and more of your population needs it, and now more and more of that population is in prison, you're going to have a lot of people in prison that are diabetic. Now, they're not going to be able to earn a job. They're not going to be able to pay for their diabetes medicines or for hepatitis or whatever they have, which means, according to Brown versus Plata, United States Supreme Court, you have a constitutional right to adequate, not great, but adequate health care, which will include things like insulin, which can be $300 or $400 a month per person. Mental illness behind bars. Most, and we'll see these chart in just a minute, most mental health hospitals in the United States, these large institutional hospitals, began to close in the 1970s. And as a result, the mentally ill, the percentage of people in the population didn't disappear. Very often these people wound up someplace else. So let's look at these two. So as I said, you've got this first graph here. This is the number of older prisoners. It has gone up by 280% in the last 16, 17 years. So you can see that our prisoners are getting older and older. And remember, that's going to drive up cost. The next chart over here is even a little bit more alarming. Now, if you look at it, the line in red there, you can see that the line in red starts off about 800,000. It stays pretty much constant. There's a drop in the 70s, and then it skyrockets back up to 800,000. Okay. So you'll notice that the line immediately below the red line, the kind of grayish line, starts at about 600,000 and drops to nothing. That was the inhabitants, the patients in mental hospitals. There are still a small number of people that are institutionalized in mental hospitals, but it is a fraction. It is less than 1/100th of what it was 20, 30 years ago. Conversely, you'll notice that prison hospitals and jails have tracked up. So you can see, in particular, I think, if those two are going together, you can see when it starts going back up, okay, that some of the people in prison clearly have to be ones that previously have been institutionalized in mental hospitals. And putting people that have mental issues in prison might be a necessity if you lack a mental hospital, but it creates a whole plethora of problems inside the prisons. Okay, rehabilitation. We've talked a little bit about this and in previous lectures, and one of the things I said is, one of the real constraints of rehabilitation is kind of like alcoholism. Does the person want to be reformed? If they want to be reformed, that's great. I think that's the first step. And I think it's got to have an outlet, which is rehabilitation. Now, rehabilitation can have lots of positive outputs. First of all, it can slow down recidivism. It can improve their health and their skills. It can alleviate boredom, which is really important because boredom can lead to getting in trouble, the violence. Now, unfortunately, one of the first things that's very frequently cut as budget constraints exist is programs in prison. And after all, it's difficult to defend the idea of spending money for people who've committed crimes. You're going to say, well, why are you spending money to run a vocational school in a jail when the county out here needs that vocational school and it's going to serve people that didn't commit crimes? Don't the people that behaved have more of a right than the people in the prison? And that's just, I think, an inevitable and completely rational reaction. It is a little short-sighted, however, because remember, these people are going to get out. So now they're out without a skill. Prison violence. Now, prison violence is a fact of life. It is both the actual violence and it's the potential of violence. Prisons and jails are dangerous places. And much of the culture of prison, much of this process of prisonization, if it's not based on actual violence, it's based on the perception of the perceived violence. It establishes a hierarchy. Who is in charge of the prison? Now, obviously, on paper, the prison is being run by the corrections officers. But the inmates have their own hierarchical order as well. It determines who is the victim, who is being exploited, and who isn't. It enhances one's self-image. It gives sexual relief in a predatory way. I mean, rape is a crime of, I've heard people say rape is a crime of violence. It's absolutely true. It is a crime of violence. It is also a crime, it is also a sex crime. It's a means of acquiring material goods. There's not a lot of goods you can get in prison, and sometimes the easiest way to get those goods is through force. So you remember that there is kind of a deprivation. Violence occurs because the struggle occurs. The struggle occurs because there's a lack of resources. There's a lack of consumer goods, of sex, of the staple of life. So researchers use the term relative deprivation to explain group violence as well. So as these freedoms start to disappear and they become more precious if you can get them, the resort to violence becomes more natural. Okay, at the extreme end, if they're organized in a group, we have riots. Unfortunately, riots are pretty common in American prison systems, particularly when new restrictions are placed or a harsh restriction is placed. Santa Fe recently, 33 inmates were killed and 200 injured, and in part the Santa Fe riots were the result of the prison administration really pitting inmates against each other, and there was racial and ethnic violence. In Alabama a few years ago, there were 3 riots in a year in a single prison, and this could be largely traced, one of the dominant factors at least, to really overcapacity. That they had crammed 1,000 inmates into a space designed to hold just 600. Now you can do this in the short term, but one of the things we've done over the years in studying density of population is the more dense a population, whether we're talking about human beings or rats, and I don't mean to say that inmates are rats there, I'm just drawing a quick analogy, is the more you increase the amount of the density of the population, the more trouble and problems you have. Prison rape. The interesting thing about prison rape is it's one of the few areas of rape that you can tell jokes about. These 2 slides, would you joke about this man being raped? Would you joke, if this woman was being raped, would you help her? And then the second part of that slide is it changes what they look like from a civilian to a prison inmate. So rates of prison rape or sexual assault are difficult to establish, in part because there are penalties attached to it. Rape goes underreported. It's difficult to conduct surveys. It's difficult to do analysis. Very often, a victim of rape might be engaging in other activity that could be punishable, or themselves they just might be punished. So we're guessing at the low end that 1 out of 10 inmates are raped in a given period of time. Pick your period of time you want. Race and ethnicity, and this is a bit of a minefield to discuss. You cannot institutionally segregate. You can't say, okay, we're going to put everybody who's black in this wing. We're going to put everybody who's white in this group of cells. We're going to put everybody who's Chinese in this one. Everybody that's a Mormon in this one. You can't do that. However, one of the things that you clearly see if you go into a prison today is that prisoners self-segregate. It's somewhat ironic, but self-segregation is most common in prisons, just like it's extremely common in churches. So you do see mixed congregations. You do see congregations that are mixed ethnic and mixed racial. But it is very common in American society to see churches that are predominantly black or predominantly white, that are predominantly Hispanic. And sometimes you'll be driving and you will see a sign that says Mass or services in Spanish, or Mass or services in minority language. There's a sign near me where there is a community of Southeast Asians, Vietnamese primarily, and there's a sign that services are conducted in Vietnamese as well. There's another church near me that it has signs for Korean. So race and ethnicity plays a major role in a prisoner's life. Prison violence can be a result of this racial tension, these groups. Race determines who your friends are, what your job assignment is, even sometimes your cell locations. Minority groups in prison often seize on race to help form an identity in prison, and this is often finally expressed in gangs. Okay, so prison gangs and security threat groups are what are called STGSs, or security threat groups, STGs. If race and ethnicity becomes the primary focus, and this is expressed in a gang, then these gangs will operate at high levels of organization or lower levels of organization inside prisons. So, and they don't just end there. And we know that about 30% of male prisoners are in a gang in prison, and about 9% of female prisoners. We also know that very often they don't stop being members of gang when they get out. Some gangs, and this can be white gangs like the Aryan Brotherhood or the Aryan Nation. It can be ethnic gangs. It can be racial gangs. They recruit in prison. They establish an identity in prison so that when you get out, you are still a member of the Bloods, or the Chris, or the Aryan Nation, or whatever group we're talking about. All right, let's talk a little bit about the flip side of this. We've talked quite a bit about the inmates. Let's talk a little bit about the corrections officers. I have great sympathy for the corrections officers in that they do an absolutely vital job for which they get very little respect. There's been an attempt to raise the prestige of them. One of the things that has started to happen in the last couple decades at least is that we've kind of stopped using words that have almost come derogatory, like you're just a guard, or you're, in a slang, you're a screw. All right, and we started using a more formal term, correction officer. If you want to be a corrections officer, you do take civil service exams typically. You will go through some classwork and physical training. There's some military training associated with it. It is, to be honest, typically not as rigorous as it is to become a police officer. Although I think that's changing in some jurisdictions. It's much closer than it ever was. They're ranked typically based upon a military structure. So you have captains, lieutenants, sergeants, and actually once you get higher, those kind of disappear. So like the warden of a prison isn't called, general or colonel or something. If we think about the typical correctional officer, we're thinking about a block officer, maybe a workdale supervisor, someone you see on the side of the road, a yard officer, a tower guard. Those are all things that are done. They're all very important parts, but that's not the only part of a prison administration. We do have female corrections officers, and for many years they were not hired because they thought, well, you could only have women watching women. That was it. Now today that's changed. There's more than 100,000 women that work in correctional facilities. And we haven't seen a big difference on the effectiveness of women versus men. One of the primary, if not the primary, problem seems to be sexual misconduct. But this exists for both genders. So male correction officers working in female prisons will cross the line, and women working in male prisons will cross the line. So these issues exist for both genders, but it's viewed as one of the most serious problems. All right, so what about disciplining inmates? What can we do with discipline? Well, we want to ensure a safe and orderly living environment. We want to get them to respect the authority, and we want to teach them values. So there's this, I would say there's the formal prison prisonization that we want. We want to take someone and make them an inmate that is obedient, that is interested in not going back, is interested in reform. Then on the other side, I would call it the informal prisonization. The tensions and the pressures inside prison to turn into something far less than ideal. As far as sanctioning prisoners, what can we do? How do we control them? And I've used the term, of course, you've got carrots and sticks before. You've got punishments and you've got rewards. So inmates, inmates will be punished if they break the rules of the prison. And this can be the most difficult and stressful part of a corrections officer's job. And these punishments range all the way from loss of privilege. Okay, you're not going to have access to the canteen, or you won't have access to communication with the outside, all the way to, which is a very common one, solitary confinement. So we are legally able to use force in prisons if it is in furtherance of a legitimate security interest. Now, a prison guard just can't say, well, I'm just going to go up and smack that guy in the back of the head with a baton. That's as illegal as if he did it in the street, as if he did it in prison. But corrections officers can use force if they are acting in self-defense, if they are trying to defend the safety of a third person, if they're trying to uphold the rules of the institution, and this is where we start to get a few problems. They're trying to prevent escape, or if they're trying to prevent a crime. They are not allowed to be malicious and sadistic. Sometimes what you have to understand is there is a continuum of the use of force, all the way from ordering, shouting, shoving, hitting, shooting. You can see how that escalates. And then there is what they're trying to do. If you're trying to tell someone to put out a cigarette, you can certainly yell at them. You can't shoot them. So you can see that there is a gradation of force based upon a gradation of violation. Now I want to mention just a little bit about solitary confinement, because in the last chapter we talked some about how the early Pennsylvania system did it and the early Auburn system did it and how much problem it was. Now we do a fair amount of this. Now we call it different things, and what I'm talking about here can include long-term solitary confinement. It can be called SHU, which is special housing units, or management control units, communication control units, security threat group control units, got a bunch of other names. And here's the shocking statistic. 80,000 inmates in the United States currently are in some form of solitary confinement. And I'm talking usually long-term solitary confinement here. So this can range all the way from a few weeks to months to as long as 25 years. The long-term damage and problems that result from solitary confinement include hallucinations, hypersensitivity to noise and touch, paranoia, and its cousin, insomnia, feelings of fear and rage, distortion of time, PTSD, and even increased rates of suicide. The United Nations widely categorizes long-term solitary confinement as a torture, although the United States, as I said, has 80,000 people in solitary confinement. So prisoners do have some rights, and this we're coming full circle to where we had kind of asked some questions. The 13th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, though, says that they don't have the rights of everybody else. Remember, the 13th frees the slaves in the United States, but it says you can restrict people and their rights for violations of crime. Now, traditionally, for the last 100-odd years, really until the 1970s, from the 13th Amendment, which was adopted in the 1860s through today, 1865, through the 1970s, courts pretty much treated inmates going in as dead. It was sometimes called civil dead, or what your book calls hands-off doctrine. You're in prison, we're not concerned. Prisoners don't have rights to go to court. We were not going to interfere in what went on in prison absent completely outrageous behavior. Now today, really starting in the last 40, 50 years, there's been more of a balancing act where we said, well, prisoners have some rights, and you can balance the certain basic human rights versus the security needs of the correctional institution itself. So there's a couple things we look at here. In Estelle versus Gamble, a 1976 case, and if you want, in Wake Tech, we have a correctional law course. You have to show that the prison officials were unaware of harmful conditions, and if they were aware, that they didn't take any steps to correct those. Very difficult standard. So it's not easy to show that an administration was deliberately indifferent. You also have to show, and this is Wilson versus Setyer, 1991, that you are denied certain basic human necessities: food, warmth, shelter, exercise. Interestingly enough, one that's emerging, and I'm kind of waiting for a line of cases, is air conditioning. As you think about prisons in particularly in the southern locations of the United States, but also increasingly as climate changes in the northern parts, you can have inmates that are housed in conditions where the temperatures go to 120, 125, life-threatening, because you're not going to air condition most places. Okay, we talked a little bit about female corrections officers. Let's talk a little bit about female inmates. Coming in, they often lack self-efficacy. They often have links to parental stress. Either they're coming out of a bad parental arrangement, or they themselves have it. They have higher rates of mental health issues than the male population. They are far more likely themselves to be victims of physical and sexual abuse. They often have, or are coming out of, poor relationships. And they have high rates of poverty and homelessness. So, I mean, it's pretty grim when you look at female inmates coming in. Here's some interesting thing, though. If you look at the prison population of women, now, admittedly, this is a far smaller sample. It's a tenth of the size of the male sample. One of the things you see is that there's not as great a racial disparity. So if we look at the total population, if you recall, African Americans are grossly overrepresented. Now here, African Americans are overrepresented as a percentage of the ethnic and race population, but nowhere near as bad as it was. So this would argue that if there is systemic racism, it seems to be particularly enforced against male genders and not female genders. The age breakdown also is interesting. Pretty much the age cohorts, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, all have very similar representations. One of the reasons we have this is that, and this is somewhat reflective, that women tend to get shorter sentences. Whereas a man might get a sentence of 25 or 30 years, a woman might get a sentence of 10. So you're going to have more of a breakdown that's equal and fewer. It's a slightly slower pace of aging. They obviously have some special problems. Here's a big one. 7 out of every 10 female prisoners have at least one minor child, 70%. Now, if you're going to take a mother and lock her up in prison, you're going to have to accept that, particularly if she's a single parent, that congratulations, you've got not only if we just look at the financial costs, forget the emotional, the physical, the psychological issues, you've got the issue of, all right, you're going to house her, what are you going to do with the kid? Or kids. They're going to wind up in foster care, which means you're going to expend more money. Inmates are often housed at great distance from their children. It's hard for them to stay in touch. So very often you've got a foster care system, which becomes an adjunct to the prison system. Now, as for culture, women's prisons have a much different vibe. They are lower levels of gang violence. It does exist. There are female gangs. There are low levels of violence, but there's high degrees of sexual victimization inside women's prisons. And one of the things that psychologists and criminologists have noticed is that women tend to reinvent the family inside prison. They create what were called pseudo or false families, where inmates play specific roles. Particularly younger inmates often rely on convicts, older inmates who act as mothers for emotional support and companionship. And this can include things like even a sexual relationship. Quick chart here: when women get pregnant, you'll notice that women in prison and jails in 2017 who were pregnant when admitted. So if you're just looking at who gets admitted to jail, you're looking at 3 to 5%, whether you're looking at 3 in federal or 4 in state, or 5% in county jails who are pregnant. Return to society. So let's move away from just talking about that. Let's talk about the idea that everyone's getting out. About 640,000 people per year are coming out of American prisons, jails. Many inmates face problems in getting out. So you might be on parole, you might have maxed out your sentence, you might have been pardoned, and that's exceedingly rare. There might be a temporary furlough. It exists, becoming a little more common, but all these are ways that people get out. So when they're out, you've got this shock. There are obviously barriers for them to re-enter society and become useful, productive, happy members of society. So prisoner reentry is a correction strategy designed to prepare them for this. And in the old days it was, all right, let's give them a trade, let's give them an education. And specifically, you will focus on them being reintegrated into the community now. This may, by the way, entail mental health treatment. It may entail physical treatments as well, things they have to deal with. A released inmate has to really adjust to a challenge of economical, technological, and social changes. Imagine if you had gone into prison 25 years ago, right? It was before 9/11. It was before the ubiquitous cell phone that everyone's on. It was really before the computer age in many sense. We had computers, trust me, 25 years ago, but they were nowhere near the impact that they exist today. Someone comes out and it's like a time traveler coming to the future trying to integrate. So they can have problems of no transportation. Now we have an admittedly fairly weak public transportation system in the United States, but it's a necessity to have a job to be able to move, get transportation. That can be difficult. Housing is difficult. Landlords are hesitant to rent to inmates or ex-inmates. And there are limits on what they can be employed. And this can be complicated by their age when they come out, a lack of experience, and of course, since we know that mental illness is common, their mental illness. Recidivism remains a very tough problem, but it does seem, if we start to look at these charges, that we can drop recidivism rates if we can increase education. So you'll notice in almost all of those attempts, any correctional program will drop it, but vocational education will drop it from 45% to 27%. Any correctional job can drop it 17%. So construction can drop it. Correctional enterprise, anything, particularly work release, by the way, is very helpful in cutting down the rate of recidivism. So again, here's some of the issues. Lack of housing, lack of jobs, support from your family. Very often these families that get out, they're very broken. The divorce rates inside prison are exceedingly high. A man who goes into prison who's married, there's a high probability, certainly compared to the rest of the population, that he will be divorced. I'm thinking recently I was watching a special on Jim Baker, who was a preacher here in North Carolina who went to prison. He was married to Tammy Faye Baker. And he went to prison and she divorced him. It's pretty common. Programs and services can be issues. Health can be services. Very often prisoners will come out. They can be HIV positive. They can have hepatitis issues. There can be substance abuse problems. There can be the issue of parole violation and recidivism. All these make it very difficult. What we want to do is we want to promote desistance. We want to decrease criminal activity and increase this reintegration. And I think it's much like the alcoholic example I gave earlier. The best way to treat an alcoholic is when he wants to be treated. It's very difficult to compel a change internally psychologically. It's much easier to reinforce a change that a person's already arrived at. They're going to need help. You're going to have to understand that you simply can't throw them out the door and say, good luck. And this preparation has to start well before actual release. Now, what works? Community-based reentry programs seem to work. These allowing for reentry. Even what happens is 43% wind back up in prison. You can get them jobs. That's extremely important. And sometimes the ability to eventually live down their criminal record, to get it expunged, to allow for a fresh start. This is sort of ban the box laws, where you say you can't ask people if they were arrested for certain crimes. Now, we're going to close on a couple special conditions. Sex offenders getting out of prison. Very often a sex offender is going to have special conditions imposed upon him because society has, I think legitimately, a greater fear of sex offenders and their release. It's hard to see how they changed in prison. They, particularly if you're dealing with someone that was targeting children, they are very often subject to much greater levels of supervision after prison. You can have special conditions imposed on them, such as no contact with children, mandatory mental health treatment, no residency close to children, no employment around children. All are very, very common. One of the things that goes on is, and I just called this guy up at random, I didn't need to particularly pick on him too much, but this is Alex Adrian Martin. He lives in Raleigh. I pulled this off of the North Carolina Sex Offender Registry. It is a public record, so I'm not outing or attacking anybody here. But I had picked a location up in North Raleigh towards the western part. That's 540 there, and there's US 1 that bisects it, which becomes capital eventually. So you'll notice if you look at this, all those little shields, all those little gold shields, those are all sex offenders. So, this is not a problem that goes away. Every state, including North Carolina, has some types of sex offender registry, and many states have it online. And we can search this, and offenders are required to register and update their information. This is both seen as a law enforcement tool and a protection against society as general. Okay, well, we did it right in about 40 minutes as I like. This is the last one of our corrections chapters, and when you're ready to move on, we'll go into juvenile justice.